Everything ready for me?
Yes, Mr. Caro, everything is ready.
Sir, I didn't touch you.
Then why are you standing right there?
I did nothing. The coffee came from behind the bar.
What did you just do? Don't lie to me.
You have no idea what you just did. You just made the biggest mistake of your life.
That scar. Where did you get that scar?
The scorched orange glove sat still at the bottom of the canvas tote bag, beneath a notebook and a half-empty bottle of water. Renata Hale Boucher didn't look at it. She had never needed to look to know it was still there. The lobby of the Aldermere Hotel in Charleston glowed beneath crystal chandeliers hanging nearly 30 feet above the marble floor. The scent of fresh lilies mixed with the smell of dark roasted coffee from the bar near the entrance. A small string ensemble was tuning violins in the corner, preparing for the hotel's launch press conference, 30 minutes away. Renata arrived early. She always arrived early. She wore a denim jacket worn thin at the cuffs, khaki pants, and flat shoes that had walked across more job sites than anyone could count. The canvas bag hung over her left shoulder, its strap mended once already. No one in the lobby looked at her for more than 2 seconds. That was the thing she liked about looking like nobody at all. She had a 10 o'clock meeting with the hotel's director of community relations, who had reached out to her fund about a grant for a workplace safety training program. She checked the time on a phone with a cracked screen, then found a seat near the large window overlooking the harbor. 11 minutes later, the revolving door at the main entrance began spinning faster, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a notch. Desmond Whitfield Caro walked in ahead of 2 assistants and a videographer, wearing a charcoal gray suit cut to his exact measurements, his deep red tie perfectly straight. 52 years old, gray at both temples in a way that looked planned rather than aged into. He was the chief executive officer of Caro and Latimer Holdings, the company listed as the developer behind this very hotel. The front desk staff straightened. The floor manager came rushing out from the back to shake his hand before he had even finished crossing the room. Junior Alvarez Pratt, 24 years old, was holding a tray of champagne glasses for the reception, pressed against the wall as the group passed. He had worked at the Aldermere for 7 months, ever since his wife, Dana, gave birth to their first daughter. The hospital bill still standing at $3,140, and Junior had learned to stand still, smile, and never be the first to speak when a VIP walked through. It happened in seconds. A young bartender, rushing to refill the ice well, collided with a co-worker carrying a fresh pot of coffee. The scalding liquid splashed sideways, landing across the sleeve and front lapel of Desmond's gray suit. He didn't see the collision. He only saw Renata, rising from her seat to grab a napkin from a nearby dispenser, at the exact moment the stain spread across his jacket. In the half-second, before reason could catch up, his anger had already chosen its target. "What did you just do?" he barked, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd in the lobby. Renata explained, calmly, that she hadn't touched him, that the spill had come from behind the bar, that she had only just stood up. She kept her voice even, the way she kept her voice even in situations far more dangerous than this one. Desmond wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind in that instant, and no explanation from a woman in a denim jacket was going to change it. He raised his hand and struck Renata Hale Boucher across the face in front of dozens of witnesses. The sound of it seemed to linger longer than it should have. The entire lobby fell silent. A few guests gasped. Somewhere behind them, a phone was already raised, recording every second of what would soon become the most talked-about video in the city. Junior stood frozen, the tray of champagne glasses trembling slightly in his hands. He had watched Desmond Caro raise his voice at staff 3 times in the past 7 months. He had stayed silent all 3 times. This time, something in him wouldn't let him look away. Renata didn't cry. She didn't shout. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked directly into Desmond Caro's eyes with a calm, that unsettled everyone watching more than tears ever could have. She didn't raise her voice. She only said, quietly enough that people had to lean in to hear, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Then she turned, picked up her canvas bag, and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room that wouldn't be able to talk about anything else for the rest of the afternoon. Desmond laughed it off, the way men, who have never faced real consequences, tend to laugh off warnings they don't understand. He straightened his jacket, muttered something about people manufacturing drama for attention, and told an assistant to find him a new suit before the press conference. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, but no one challenged him directly. This was a man who sat on 3 boards, who funded half the charity galas in the city, who could end a career with a single phone call. Most of the witnesses assumed Renata's parting words were nothing more than the wounded pride of someone just humiliated in public, an empty threat to save face on her way out the door. One person didn't laugh. Marcus Delane Wofford, 51 years old, the hotel's director of security, had been standing just a few feet away and had seen the whole thing. But what froze him wasn't the slap. It was Renata's wrist, exposed for a moment, as she picked up her bag. A thin, pale scar curved along her forearm, shaped almost like a lightning bolt. Marcus had seen that exact scar only once before in his life, 15 years earlier, under circumstances he had spent a decade and a half trying not to remember. His chest tightened. The room around him blurred for a moment, as old images surged back uninvited. Smoke. The shriek of metal as scaffolding gave way. The screaming of men trapped behind a wall of chemical fire. He moved quickly, catching up to Renata before she could disappear into the crowded street outside. His voice trembled as he asked her a single question, a phrase that would mean nothing to anyone else walking past, a password that existed only between people who had once lived through something unspeakable together. Renata stopped walking. She turned slowly and gave him the exact answer he had been both hoping for and dreading. The one answer only one person on earth could have known. Marcus's hands began to shake. He had spent 15 years believing the woman who saved his life had vanished without a trace. Maybe even believing she hadn't survived that night at all. And now she was standing in front of him on an ordinary sidewalk, having just been struck across the face by the very man he had sworn to protect. For a long moment, Marcus simply stood there on the curb, watching the back of Renata's denim jacket disappear into the crowd, feeling 15 years of unanswered questions settle suddenly into place. He had built an entire career protecting powerful men precisely because he had once felt utterly powerless inside a burning building, certain he was going to die, until a stranger appeared out of the smoke and refused to let that happen. He had told himself for years that the debt could never be repaid because the woman who saved him no longer existed anywhere he could find her. Now she existed 2 blocks away, rubbing her cheek, where his own employer had just struck her. He turned back toward the hotel entrance, where Desmond stood waiting for his replacement suit, with no idea that the woman he had just dismissed as a troublemaker was about to upend everything he believed about his own life. Marcus walked back in, his expression so altered that even Desmond paused mid-sentence to look at him. "We need to talk. Right now," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent in a way his employer had never heard from him before. Not in 10 years of crisis meetings, boardroom disputes, or late-night emergency calls. Something in his tone made even Desmond Caro, a man unaccustomed to being told what to do, fall silent and follow him to a quiet corner of the lobby. Desmond's irritation flared the moment they were alone, his patience already worn thin by the ruined suit and the inconvenience of the whole morning. He demanded to know why his own head of security was making a scene over some woman who'd clearly been looking for an excuse to cause trouble. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked Desmond to sit down, and something about the rare seriousness on his face made Desmond comply, without his usual sarcasm. What Marcus said next would change everything that followed, though neither man yet understood the full weight of it. 15 years ago, Marcus told him, before he ever took a job guarding wealthy executives, he had worked as a rescue technician on a construction site. The job required running into places other people were running out of, One night, the Latimer Tower construction project on the edge of the city caught fire after a waterproofing chemical tank leaked and ignited, collapsing part of the scaffolding and trapping 11 workers on the third floor behind a stairwell warped by the heat. Marcus was one of the technicians sent in, and within minutes, the rescue operation went badly wrong, the smoke thicker than anyone predicted, the exits collapsing one after another. He remembered the chaos with a clarity that had never faded, no matter how many years passed. In the middle of that chaos, a young woman, with no business being inside a burning building, appeared out of the smoke, guiding trapped workers through a service corridor that didn't even appear on the official rescue maps. She moved with an unreasonable calm, pulling people through narrow gaps, carrying a child on her back, through smoke so thick that even professional firefighters were struggling to breathe. At one point, a section of metal scaffolding came down and tore across her forearm, leaving a wound deep enough that Marcus, even then, assumed she would lose the arm entirely. She didn't stop moving. She kept guiding survivors out until every last person on that floor had escaped, and only then did she let anyone look at her injury. By the time medical crews tried to get her name for the official report, she had already vanished from the chaos outside the building, slipping away before reporters or officials could catch up to her. The story became something close to local legend among the firefighters who'd been there that night. The nameless woman who saved an entire floor of workers and disappeared before anyone could properly thank her. Marcus had searched for her for years afterward, quietly, on his own time, never finding a single solid lead. He had long since accepted he would never know who she was. And then, 15 years later, he saw the scar on her wrist in a hotel lobby, seconds after his own employer struck her across the face. Desmond sat in silence. As Marcus spoke, something uneasy shifting behind his eyes. The name Renata Hale Boucher, spoken aloud by Marcus, tugged at a fragment of old memory, something connected to files he had once seen and never thought about again. Something tied to the early years of his father's company. He didn't yet understand the connection, but a cold unease was already spreading into his chest. The first crack in the certainty that had carried him through every confrontation of his adult life. Marcus finally looked his employer dead in the eye and said the words that would not leave Desmond's mind for the rest of the day. "The woman you just hit," he said quietly, "is the woman who saved my life." Desmond spent the rest of that day distracted in a way his staff had never seen, snapping at no one in particular, sitting through long silences in meetings that normally commanded his full attention. That night, he asked one of his closest assistants to quietly pull every old record connected to the Latimer Tower project Marcus had described. A request that sent the young assistant digging through archived files that hadn't been touched in over a decade. What she found early the next morning unsettled even her, and she brought the documents to Desmond's office with visible hesitation, unsure how her employer would react to what they revealed. The Latimer Tower construction site that burned 15 years earlier had belonged, at the time, to a company developed by Desmond's own father, a fact Desmond had either forgotten or never fully registered, as a young man more focused on his own career than the operations of a single job site. The fire had nearly destroyed the company entirely, threatening lawsuits, an insurance collapse, and a public relations disaster that could have ended the family business before Desmond ever inherited it. Yet the company had survived, largely because the death toll had been far lower than initial reports feared, a fact internal documents attributed to the unexplained intervention of a young woman who had guided dozens of workers to safety through a corridor no one else had ever used. Desmond read through the documents twice, his hands gripping the edges of the pages, as the full scope of what he was reading settled over him. If that fire had claimed the lives initially feared, the lawsuits alone would have bankrupted the company, stripping his family of the empire he now controlled, the buildings bearing his name, the board seats, the life he had built on a foundation he had never once questioned. He thought of every interview he had ever given, describing his own grit and vision as the source of everything he had achieved. Every speech in which he credited his discipline and instinct for his rise, never once mentioning a fire, a stranger, or a debt that had quietly underwritten his entire career. Everything he owned, everything he had ever taken pride in, rested in some measure on the actions of a stranger who had walked into a burning building and walked out with nothing to show for it, but a scar she had carried in silence for 15 years. The deeper Desmond dug, the worse it got. Internal memos showed company executives at the time had discussed locating the woman who'd saved the workers in order to offer compensation, perhaps even a public reward, both as a moral gesture and as good publicity for a company recovering from disaster. But the records simply stopped there, the trail abandoned, no follow-up documentation, no settlement, no payment of any kind ever issued to anyone matching her description. A memo dated just weeks after the fire noted simply that the search for the unidentified woman had been deprioritized due to more pressing matters. A single line Desmond read, over and over, struck by how easily a debt that large had been filed away and forgotten. Renata Hale Boucher and her family, whoever had raised her, whatever life she had lived since that night, had received nothing. Not a dollar, not a letter, not even an acknowledgement that the company understood what she had done for them. Desmond sat alone in his office long, after his staff had gone home, staring at a photograph from the old company archive showing the burned remains of the construction site. For the first time in years, he felt something close to shame settle into his chest. He had spent his entire adult life believing his success came from his own intelligence, his own discipline, his own relentless work ethic, and in a single afternoon he had discovered that the very ground beneath his empire had been secured by a woman he had publicly humiliated without a second thought. Marcus spent 2 days convincing Renata to meet with Desmond again, and it took considerable effort before she agreed. She had no interest in speaking with Desmond Caro. No desire to relive a story she had deliberately and carefully buried for 15 years. When she finally agreed, it was only because Marcus asked her, as a personal favor, gently reminding her that some conversations, however unwanted, still deserve to happen. She met Desmond in a quiet office, away from cameras, away from staff, and made clear, from the moment she sat down, that she expected nothing from him and wanted even less. As the conversation unfolded slowly, with visible reluctance on Renata's part, a picture of her life began to emerge that surprised Desmond more than the fire itself had. She lived modestly in a small apartment on the edge of the city, drove a car nearly 15 years old, and worked long hours that left little room for the comfortable life her actions had indirectly handed to others. Over the years, she had founded a small nonprofit, the Forge and Foundation Relief Fund, dedicated to supporting construction workers injured on the job, the very kind of accident that had nearly cost her her own arm. She funded it quietly, often out of her own modest savings, never seeking publicity, never applying for grants that required her name to appear anywhere public. She told him, without a trace of self-pity, that she had helped thousands of people over the years find medical care, legal support, and basic dignity after accidents that left them forgotten by the companies that employed them. She had never given an interview. She had never accepted an award, even when organizations had tried more than once to honor her work. She believed, she said simply, that the moment her name became the story, the people she was trying to help would stop mattering to anyone, and that was a trade she refused to make. She described, almost reluctantly, the families she had helped over the years. A welder who lost 2 fingers and couldn't afford the surgery his insurance refused to cover. A young mother working night shifts at a warehouse who broke her spine in a fall the company blamed on her own carelessness. Renata had sat with them in hospital waiting rooms, filled out paperwork no one else would help them complete, found lawyers willing to work for next to nothing because she asked them herself. None of it had ever appeared in a press release. None of it had ever needed to. Desmond listened in silence, increasingly aware of how small his own definition of success looked next to hers. For the first time and longer than he could remember, Desmond Caro felt genuinely embarrassed, not because anyone was watching him, but because of who he had revealed himself to be in a moment he had assumed would carry no consequences. He began to apologize, stumbling over words that didn't come naturally to him, offering compensation recognition, anything he could think of to undo what he had done in that lobby. Renata let him finish before she answered, her voice steady, entirely without anger. "I don't need your apology," she told him, and the words landed on Desmond harder than the loudest accusation ever could have. While Desmond sat, with the weight of that conversation, the rest of the world had already moved on, without waiting for his private reckoning. The video from the lobby had spread overnight, shared and reshared, until it reached corners of the country that had never heard Desmond Caro's name before that week. Commentators dissected every second of the footage. Analysts speculated about what it meant for his company's reputation, and within 72 hours, Caro and Latimer holding stock had dropped sharply as investors grew nervous about the public relations storm gathering around their chief executive. Journalists who had spent years covering corporate scandal recognized an opportunity too big to pass up. Within days, several reporters had identified Renata Hale Boucher by name, tracing her connection to the small nonprofit she had built so quietly over the years. What they uncovered stunned even seasoned investigative writers. The woman struck on camera by one of the most powerful executives in the state turned out to be the same woman whispered about in old firefighting circles, the nameless hero of a construction fire that had nearly ended an entire company 15 years earlier. Public reaction shifted overnight, from outrage over a single slap to something far bigger, a collective fascination with a woman who had quietly saved lives and asked for nothing in return, only to be humiliated by the very system her sacrifice had helped preserve. Headlines called her the forgotten hero of the city. Strangers who had never met her began sharing information about her nonprofit, donations pouring in faster than the small organization had ever seen. Talk shows debated the footage frame by frame. Editorial columns argued over what the moment revealed about wealth, race, and the assumptions powerful men carry into ordinary rooms without ever questioning them. It was during that surge of public attention that a persistent young journalist, digging deeper into the original fire investigation from 15 years earlier, uncovered something that complicated the story even further. Old commendation records showed that someone else entirely had received official credit for the rescue operation that night, a name with no connection to Renata Hale Boucher. The journalist pulled archived newspaper clippings, award ceremony photographs, and internal company praise, all crediting a man who, according to every first-hand account Marcus and other survivors gave, had not actually been inside the building during the critical moments of the rescue. The man's name was Gerald Thomason Pike, a former construction supervisor at the site who, in the years following the fire, had built an entire career on the reputation of being the hero who saved his workers that night. He had accepted a regional safety medal. He had received a substantial bonus from the company, grateful for limiting its liability exposure. He had used the story in speeches, in interviews, in his own later business ventures, permanently attaching his name to an act of courage that belonged to someone else entirely. For 15 years, Renata Hale Boucher had said nothing, never once stepping forward to correct the record, content to disappear rather than fight for recognition she never seemed to want. When journalists confronted Gerald Pike with survivor testimony that contradicted his long-told story, he denied everything at first, dismissing the claims as the confused memories of traumatized workers misremembering a chaotic night. But as more survivors came forward, each independently describing the same young woman, with the same severe injury to her forearm, the cracks in his account became impossible to ignore. Marcus, watching the unfolding investigation with growing fury, agreed to speak publicly for the first time about what he had witnessed that night, knowing his testimony carried weight precisely because he had nothing personal to gain from telling the truth. Desmond, still working through his own complicated reckoning with Renata, made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than letting his legal team quietly manage the unfolding scandal the way corporations typically handle embarrassing revelations, he chose to use his company's resources to push the investigation into public view, funding an independent inquiry into exactly what had happened the night of the fire and exactly who deserved credit for what occurred. His advisors warned him that exposing a 15-year-old cover-up connected to his own family's company could damage his reputation further. Desmond, for the first time, didn't seem to care about that calculation the way he once would have. Gerald Pike, sensing the walls closing in around him, attempted one final desperate move before the truth became impossible to contain. He reached out privately to several former colleagues who had also benefited indirectly from the company's gratitude after the fire, suggesting that if his reputation collapsed, theirs would likely follow soon after. He reminded them of old favors, old silences, old agreements, none of them ever put in writing, hoping the weight of shared guilt would be enough to keep their mouths shut a little longer. One of those former colleagues, a retired safety inspector who had spent years quietly uneasy with the story everyone told, finally decided he was done carrying someone else's lie. "If I go down," Gerald Pike reportedly told a former associate in a recorded conversation later submitted as evidence, "plenty of other people are going down with me." The threat, intended to buy his silence, instead became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him once it surfaced. The formal hearing took place several weeks later in a courtroom packed beyond capacity, with reporters lining the hallways outside and cameras positioned at every available angle. Marcus testified first, his voice steady despite the visible emotion in every word, describing in detail the young woman who had guided him and dozens of trapped workers through a corridor that didn't exist on any rescue map. He spoke of the injury to her arm, the calm she maintained, as metal scaffolding rained down around her, the disappearance that followed before anyone could properly thank her. His testimony, delivered without exaggeration or theatrical flourish, carried a weight that silenced the entire courtroom. One by one, survivors of the fire took the stand to corroborate his account. Men and women now in their 40s and 50s who had spent 15 years believing the woman who saved them had vanished forever without recognition. Each described the same details independently, the same severe wound, the same unwavering calm, the same refusal to wait around for thanks once the last worker had been led to safety. Defense attorneys representing Pike tried to challenge the consistency of memories formed during a traumatic event, but the sheer volume of matching testimony made the argument increasingly difficult to sustain in court. Documents obtained through the independent inquiry Desmond had funded further dismantled Pike's narrative, revealing internal company correspondence from years earlier in which executives privately acknowledged uncertainty about who actually deserved credit for the rescue, choosing Pike as the public face of the story largely because he was already an employee in good standing, while the true rescuer remained unidentified and unavailable for comment. The fabrication hadn't been a single lie, but a slow accumulation of convenient silences, each person involved choosing comfort over honesty until an entire false history had hardened into accepted fact. Pike's own attorney, midway through the proceedings, requested a private recess, later confirmed by courtroom staff to have advised his client that no remaining defense could withstand the weight of testimony already entered into the record. When the hearing resumed, Pike's expression had changed entirely, the practiced confidence of earlier days replaced by the stillness of a man who finally understood there was no version of events left for him to control. On the final day of the hearing, the presiding judge ordered Pike's arrest on charges related to fraud and falsified records connected to his original safety commendation, charges that carried the real possibility of significant prison time given the scope of benefits he had fraudulently claimed over the years. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as he was led away. And for the first time in 15 years, the public record finally began to reflect what had actually happened inside that burning building. As the hearing drew to its close, the courtroom turned its attention to Desmond Caro, who had sat quietly through the entire proceeding, watching the foundation of his family's success dismantled and rebuilt before his eyes in front of the entire public. When the judge invited any final statement relevant to the proceedings, Desmond rose slowly and walked to the front of the courtroom, aware that every camera in the building was now fixed on him. He began by acknowledging, without excuse or deflection, that he had struck a woman in public out of arrogance and assumption, judging her on nothing more than her appearance, and his own inflated sense of importance. He admitted that for years he had built his identity around the belief that his success was entirely his own creation, never once questioning the deeper history of the company he had inherited, never once wondering whose sacrifice had quietly protected the empire he so proudly claimed as his own achievement. His voice, normally controlled and commanding in every public appearance, wavered as he continued. In front of cameras broadcasting to a national audience, Desmond Caro knelt down in the middle of the courtroom and offered a formal apology to Renata Hale-Boucher, who sat in the gallery watching without expression. He spoke of the assistants who had watched him strike her and said nothing, the bystanders who had filmed the moment without intervening. The culture inside his own company that had taught everyone around him that challenging him carried more risk than staying silent ever would. He said he understood now that the silence in that lobby hadn't been about Renata alone, that it reflected something rotten that had been allowed to grow for years under his leadership, and that fixing it would take more than a single gesture in a courtroom. He announced the creation of a substantial compensation fund for workers and families affected by industrial accidents connected to his company's history, including a direct settlement, 15 years overdue, for Renata herself, finally acknowledged. He went further still, announcing he would transfer a meaningful percentage of his personal shares in the company into Renata's nonprofit, ensuring it would have resources far beyond anything it had ever operated with before that day. The courtroom fell into an unusual hush as everyone waited to see how Renata would respond to a moment most people expected to bring her some measure of satisfaction or vindication. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. Even Desmond, still kneeling, seemed unsure whether her silence meant forgiveness or something else entirely. Renata rose from her seat slowly, smoothing the same denim jacket she had worn the day everything began, and walked to the front of the courtroom without hesitation. She didn't look at Desmond with anger, nor did she rush to embrace the apology being offered to her in front of the entire country. Instead, she turned to face the gathered crowd, the reporters, the survivors, the cameras broadcasting her words far beyond that room, and began to speak in the same calm, unshaken voice she had used in the lobby weeks earlier. She told them she accepted the apology, not because Desmond's words erased what had happened, but because holding on to anger had never been the kind of person she wanted to be. She thanked the survivors, who had come forward to tell the truth, and she thanked Marcus, who had carried the memory of that night for 15 years, without ever forgetting the debt he believed he owed her. Then she turned her attention to the wider audience listening, and her voice grew firmer, carrying the weight of everything she had quietly endured for so long. She told them never to judge a person by the color of their skin, never to assume the worst about someone based on the clothes they wore, the car they drove, or the neighborhood they came from. She told them that the people who change the world rarely look like the people history chooses to celebrate. That quiet sacrifice almost always goes unnoticed, while loud, convenient stories get rewarded instead. She spoke briefly of the welder and the young mother she had mentioned earlier, careful even now not to use their real names, explaining that the world is full of people doing extraordinary things in ordinary clothes, and that the failure to notice them says far more about the people looking than it ever says about the people being overlooked. She reminded the room that a scar on someone's arm could mean nothing, or it could mean everything, and the only way to know the difference is to stop assuming and start listening. When she finished speaking, the courtroom rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than anyone expected, reporters included, many of them visibly moved by words that carried none of the bitterness they had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Desmond Caro began implementing sweeping changes throughout his company, instituting new accountability standards, funding worker protection programs, and personally reviewing decades of overlooked claims his corporation had ignored over the years. His transformation, slow and imperfect, became a frequently cited case study in business circles about what genuine accountability could look like once it finally arrived. Renata's nonprofit expanded rapidly in the months that followed, opening regional offices across the country to support injured construction workers who had previously had nowhere to turn. Donations kept pouring in long, After the initial media attention faded, sustained by a steady stream of people who had read her story and wanted to be part of something that mattered beyond a single viral moment. Marcus left his position guarding executives entirely, choosing instead to work alongside Renata full-time, finally given the chance to repay a debt he had quietly carried for 15 years. He spent his days now driving between hospitals and job sites instead of boardrooms and private elevators, and more than one former colleague noted that he seemed, for the first time in years, genuinely at peace. Desmond's company released a public report a year later detailing the changes implemented since the hearing, including a dedicated department devoted entirely to reviewing historical worker injury claims that had previously been ignored or dismissed. Critics remained skeptical, pointing out that genuine change in a corporation often takes far longer than a single year to prove itself sincere, and Desmond himself never claimed otherwise in any of his public remarks. He stopped giving the kind of interviews that had once defined his public image, the bold predictions, the confident sound bites, choosing instead to speak rarely and carefully, aware now that his words carried weight he had once taken for granted. Renata left the courtroom that day without waiting for further applause or attention, walking out through a side entrance to avoid the crowd of reporters gathered at the main doors. As she stepped into the late afternoon light, a photographer caught one final image that would later be reprinted in countless articles about her story. Her sleeve pulled back slightly as she adjusted her bag, the thin, pale scar along her wrist clearly visible in the frame. She thought of an old worker she had pulled off the third floor that night, who, once he was safe, had looked at her bleeding arm and said something she had never forgotten in 15 years. "People will forget who saved them faster than you'd think," he told her, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "But don't you forget yourself." She hadn't. Even when the rest of the world forgot for 15 years, she had remembered exactly who she was, and that, more than any hearing or apology, was what had kept her standing the whole time. She took the scorched orange glove out from the bottom of the canvas bag one last time, before placing it inside a small glass case at the fund's new office, where it would remain, not as a trophy, but as a reminder to anyone who walked in that the people who change everything are rarely the ones remembered first. Renata closed the glass case, straightened it once, and turned to greet the next person who walked through the door looking for help.